This week on Political Capital, the battle lines are drawn. The president responds to the Ryan plan with his own vision to tame the deficit. The next round of negotiations may well dwarf the shutdown showdown. White House Budget Director Jack Lew is our guest on the show. And on the last word, Republican Mitt Romney makes his move. Welcome to Political Capital. I'm Julianna Goldman, in for Al Hunt this week. We begin the show with the White House Budget Director, Jack Lew, who joins me in the studio. Jack, thank you so much for the time today.
Good to be with you. Shutdown
averted, but with some unexpected fallout. Nearly a quarter of Republicans voted against the measure, effectively voting against Speaker John Boehner. Tell me, does that strengthen or weaken the president's hand to get a deal done by June?
You know, I think that it's not a big surprise that it required both Republicans and Democrats to pass a bill in the House. From the very beginning, we knew the challenge was to come up with an agreement that would be acceptable to House Republicans, Senate Democrats, and to the White House, which meant that there would be some need to come together. I hope that what it shows is that when we work together, when we're willing to cross lines, we can do the right thing for the American people and make sensible policy in the sensible center.
Okay, well, that'll be put to the test with the debt ceiling vote that we're coming up on. Even some of the president's strongest supporters, like Senator Dick Durbin, said this week that a clean debt ceiling bill is not likely, even though that's what the president would like to see. So there's a bipartisan proposal to tie it to a spending cap now of 20.6% of GDP within a decade. It has bipartisan support. Senator Claire McCaskill has signed on to this. Is this something the White House would seriously consider?
So let me answer that question first by taking on the question of whether anything should be attached to the debt limit. Our very strong view is that the debt limit should be passed as a clean, standalone bill. One of the very encouraging things about the meeting that the president had with the bipartisan leadership of Congress this week was that there was unanimous agreement in the room that we don't have an option. We have to pass the debt limit. As far as the specific provision, which I think we should discuss on its own, because parallel to the debt limit, we have a very serious and immediate need to address our fiscal challenges. I think the spending limits that are proposed there are very dangerous. And it's not that we don't need to cut spending. We do need to cut spending. But setting a spending limit, first of all, defines the problem incompletely. The problem is not just a spending problem. As the president outlined the other day, everything has to be on the table, and it's a combination of spending and revenues. Secondly, setting a limit the way that proposal and others like it would has the effect of saying we're going to pretend that the baby boom isn't retiring. We're going to pretend that more and more people aren't going to be collecting Social Security and Medicare. It's in effect pretending you can repeal the retirement of the baby boom. You can't.
But you mentioned the meeting with bipartisan leadership this week, and House Speaker John Boehner came out of that meeting and said that the president indicated to him that he would be for a debt ceiling vote with maybe a side deal running on a parallel track to cut the deficit. Was the speaker wrong there?
No, to be clear, the president said in the leadership meeting, and he reiterated in the speech he gave later in the day, that we need on a parallel track to be taking immediate action. That's why he asked Vice President Biden to chair a group of leaders in the Congress, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, to work together on putting together a framework that we can agree on.
So the president wants a clean bill, but he would support a deficit reduction measure on the side if that's what it takes to get a debt ceiling vote.
Let's not link them. We have multiple things that are urgent. We need to pass a debt limit. We cannot have the United States default on its debt. We also need to get our hands around the deficit. And I want to underscore deficit because part of the debate we're going to have is, do we have just a spending problem or do we have a deficit problem? We're very clear. Our challenge is to reduce the deficit, and that means that everything has to be on the table, and that's the conversation that we need to have.
Well, all sides do agree that breaching the debt ceiling would be disastrous. So far, though, the bond market is saying it's unlikely. At what point, though, will you be worried that investors are going to be beginning to change their mind? May 15th, May 31st? When do we really hit Armageddon?
You know, I think that hopefully we'll never be able to answer that question because we won't come close enough to know. I think what's clear is that we can't get into a situation where we're watching countdown clocks to the default of the United States. That would be unacceptable. It's not the way a great power should be seen domestically or around the world. The president was very clear that the reason we have to tackle the fiscal problems is that it undermines our national security for us not to get our hands around our fiscal challenges. It's going to be hard. There are big differences in perspective, but that doesn't mean that we can't agree. And one of the important things to come out of this week is there is a growing consensus that the size of the problem is $4 trillion over the next 10 to 12 years. There is a broad range of views as what the composition of a solution should be. Let's start and begin to agree where we can agree. If we can define the problem and on the next steps, that would be major progress.
Well, you mentioned national security, and what about agreement within the own administration? The president proposed cuts to the defense budget that went way beyond what Secretary Gates had recommended. Spokesman Jeff Morrell said that Gates told military service chiefs that the announcement is the beginning of the process and not the conclusion. The outcome is still to be determined. Did the defense secretary support finding $400 billion in spending cuts from the Pentagon's budget?
I think Secretary Gates has shown extraordinary leadership in his tenure at the Department of Defense, taking on the very hard challenge of getting rid of weapon systems that the military don't need and don't want, of reorganizing to get savings where they can be gotten by consolidating things. We have had conversations over the months since I've been back in the Office of Management and Budget.
Is he on board with $400 billion?
About how to get our hands around long-term growth. And the thing that we agree on, the White House and the Department of Defense, is that decisions we make here, policy decisions we make here, have to be based on what our national security requirements are. And what the President said in the speech, and what Secretary Gates agrees with, is that we need to do a review of what our roles and missions and therefore what our capabilities need to be. And that as we make reductions, the reductions have to be tied to those conclusions. That's a process we're launching. He's very much part of it. So is Chairman Mullen. And he's totally right. And the President said in the speech, we will make no decisions that undermine our national security. But like everything else, it has to be on the table.
The President made clear no extension of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy under his watch. But what other tax increases would he consider? The estate tax, for example, that's something that many said was a win for the nation's most affluent in the deal last year.
The President in his budget in February made very clear that we need to take seriously the question of revenues, that we need to not extend the tax cuts for the top rates. We need to bring estate taxes back to where they were in 2009, not the level that they were set at in December. And he also proposed that we scale back on the deductions and special provisions that apply in the top brackets.
So you'll leave that to the Gang of Six?
Well, no, those are very specific proposals he's made, and they're frankly proposals that are consistent with the Bowles-Simpson Commission recommendations. What he added in the speech this week is that we need to more broadly take on tax reform. Again, it's consistent with the Bowles-Simpson Commission. These are always challenges because even if you didn't raise revenue, just changing the mix means there are winners and losers. But we need to raise revenue as well as change the mix, and it will be hard, but we need to do it.
All right, Jack Lew, thank you so much for the time. And when we come back, staying on the topic, a viable deficit cutting plan is increasingly being tied to the debt ceiling vote. We'll talk to Bloomberg reporters on it when we return. Welcome back. After resolving the short-term budget battle, the search for compromise on long-term issues begins. White House correspondent Hans Nichols and congressional reporter Julie Davis join me now. Thanks, guys, for being here. Julie, the president came out in a 44-minute speech this week with his long-term plan to address the debt and deficits. Was it a game changer on the Hill?
It really was. I mean, previous to now, the discussion on these issues has been taking place really behind the scenes and mostly really in this bipartisan group, a gang of 6 senators that is trying to resolve some sort of bipartisan way forward on this. Now it's all out in the open, and actually there's a lot more partisan element injected into it because President Obama went pretty hard after the House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan in his speech.
Well, Hans, the president this week also got caught again with an open mic, a gaffe. Was he just trying to make the vice president feel better for falling asleep at his own speech?
I don't think anyone fell asleep during the fundraiser.
Well, is it something we can joke about, or is it something that's going to have serious consequences?
It has a few serious consequences because immediately after the speech, White House officials insisted that it was not a partisan speech. That this was merely meant to highlight policy differences, that their politics had nothing to do with this. That argument is undercut a little bit when the day after the president, at a $35,000 a plate fundraiser, questions not the integrity, but kind of questions Paul Ryan's mathematics and all this, his accountancy. It made it more personal. It's going to be hard moving forward because he's going to have to deal with Ryan on both the debt limit and a deficit deal.
Well, let's also talk about the Gang of Six, because, Julie, you had reported this week that the Gang of Six, Washington speak for the bipartisan group of lawmakers who are working on a debt deal, that they were concerned that they didn't get any heads up on the speech and that it would torpedo their own talks.
That's right. Yeah, there were no advance reports of the speech for them. So actually, Saxby Chambliss, the Republican who's co-leading the group, said on Monday that it was a curveball for the group.
Are they still concerned about that after the speech?
I think, the gang hasn't broke up yet. They're still talking. And this has been months in the making, and everyone says until someone walks away from the table, they're making progress. But they don't have a deal, and I think there is a concern among the Republicans that to the degree that this discussion is now seen as President Obama's turf, and he also borrowed considerably from what they're talking about in terms of a fail-safe measure to institute automatic cuts if certain debt reduction limits aren't met. Republicans are going to back away from that if that's seen as the president's proposal. They need to keep the bipartisan nature of these talks going if they want to actually get somewhere.
Well, Hans, why didn't the White House consult the Gang of Six? Why didn't they even consult the president's own defense secretary ahead of the spending cuts that the president was proposing to the Pentagon's budget that went so far beyond what Gates had supported?
One, fatigue, oversight. Two, element of surprise. They always wanted to enter these budget negotiations after the Republicans had revealed their hands. There's a great benefit, unlike chess, where the opening move, you don't want it. There's a great benefit to going second in politics. That's what the White House did. They could respond to Ryan, then overwhelm them. And there's a great deal of confidence in the West Wing that they are controlling the terms of the debate and that it's on the president's language and just what he wants to talk about.
Well, we move from debt and deficits to the debt ceiling. But in the vote for the fiscal 2011 budget that we have no shutdown now, but Speaker John Boehner lost a quarter of Republicans on that vote. Julie, what does it mean in terms of the leverage he's going to have in preventing another countdown clock to a debt limit vote?
Well, I think there's no question it weakens him in some measure. I mean, he goes into this next fight with his conservative flank, the 59 who voted against it. And in fact, it's probably more than that because he worked this vote very hard. So there are people who voted for this 2011 budget not really wanting to and saying, I'm going to hold my fire because this isn't the big fight. But the debt ceiling is the big fight. So he's now going to have to respond to those people. At the same time, he needed Democrats to help him pass the bill. So you could see how that could be seen as the makings of a bipartisan coalition going forward on the debt ceiling. But that's going to be politically tough for him to do.
And Republicans are digging their heels in saying that they want to see some sort of spending cap attached to that debt ceiling vote. Hans, does the White House think that they'll be able to get a clean bill, which is what the president says he wants?
Publicly, they're still maintaining that position. Privately, you get a sense that they know that that's not tenable, that they might have to give on that to some degree. Their position is basically that these conversations are going to run parallel but are not part of. That's a pretty clever phrase. No one really, in terms of negotiations, believes that that's how it's going to happen. And even the president's own lawmakers in his own party are saying, of course they're going to be connected.
And even the president's, one of the president's closest allies on the Hill and the Democratic whip who's in charge of counting votes for the Democrats in the Senate, Dick Durbin, said this week that the two are wedded. And he recognizes as the person who is going to have to get whatever comes to the floor through the Senate that something is going to have to be wedded to the debt ceiling increase, whether it's part of the same vote or something that happens in advance.
Well, Hans, the president's going to take the budget talk on the road next week, heading out west. Is this the beginning of 2012?
I think 2012 probably started last week in a lot of ways. What you will see is a president who's more honest and open about the fact that he's running for president, although he probably won't actually say that phrase. And it's great for him to be able to raise a lot of money and try to get the small dollar donors motivated. They need that grassroots, netroots help if they're going to have any chance of winning again.
Well, he's going to be talking about budget, debts, and deficits, but it really struck me that in Pennsylvania the other week, the president held a town hall, and it was leading up to the possibility of a shutdown. He wasn't asked about the shutdown. He wasn't asked about debt or deficits. He was asked about the pressing issues of jobs and high gas prices. So how does the White House get back to that when the conversation in Washington is all about the crushing burden of debt and deficits?
They try to go around that with local media. This is a very clear White House strategy that they think that the Washington bubble is missing the story. One of the reasons they centered the campaign in Chicago was that it wouldn't be crushed by all of this Washington news, and so they would be outside of it a little bit. They still don't really have a solid argument when gas is approaching $110. The price of oil is at 110 for the U.S. benchmark. They still don't have a great argument that unless they have some sort of silver bullet solution for the crisis in Libya.
Hans and Julie, thank you so much for joining us. And when we come back, competing visions to safeguard the country's future. It's the president versus Paul Ryan. The last word right after this break.
We will all need to make sacrifices, but we do not have to sacrifice the America we believe in. And as long as I'm president, we won't.
We need to be honest with the American people about the problems we face. We need a fact-based budget, no more accounting tricks.
Welcome back. We'll go to Margaret, Carlson, and Cato Byrne in just a moment. But first, more than a month after the devastating earthquake and tsunami hit Japan, the nuclear crisis continues. Authorities this week rated its severity at the same level as Chernobyl. Bloomberg News correspondent Zeb Eckert joins us now from Tokyo. Zeb, thanks for being with us. Question, what took the Japanese so long to come to this conclusion when the U.S. was suggesting from the beginning that the situation was worse than the Japanese were letting on?
Well, Julianna, that's really the question many people here in Japan are asking. What took so long to reach this decision to raise the nuclear threat level here? Of course, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States said the damage was worse than Japan was letting on. As for the official response, the government here said they did not want to release inaccurate information. They wanted to make sure they had accurate readings, of course, on the Fukushima Daiichi plant, make sure they had the best information possible before alarming the public. But indeed, the public here upset over the fact that it took so long, 1 month indeed, to come to that conclusion.
I bet. Well, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, she's going to be visiting Japan this weekend. Tell us, what is she going to hear from the Prime Minister about the country's plan for dealing with the nuclear fallout and the rebuilding efforts?
Well, this is a courtesy call by Hillary Clinton. She's coming here to Japan after a stop in South Korea. She is expected to meet with Naoto Kan. And, of course, she'll be asking questions as to what the government here plans to do. And that's really the question on the ground here. What will the government do? They're just beginning to lay out details for compensation plans for the people, the victims who've been evacuated around Fukushima. And, indeed, what Japan plans to do to rebuild the economy in this part of the country. Of course, Japan, a major global economy. Naoto Kan likely to say, listen, we're doing everything we can. This is a situation we've never faced before, certainly a nuclear situation that's really unprecedented.
Well, just quickly on the economy, the G7 is meeting in Washington this weekend. Representatives from Japan are here. They're sounding some optimism on the economy, but what's it like on the ground? What's the sense there?
Well, you would expect some cheerleading from the officials there at the G7, indeed the finance minister from Japan in the United States. But on the ground, the real question is, will this economy in this northeastern part of Japan be able to rebuild and do so in a timely manner? Many people concerned about their businesses, many small businesses here, and we've seen big companies like Toyota also slashing their production. They can't get the parts that they need, and this is a key question for the overall Japanese economy going forward.
Well, Zeb, thank you so much for joining us. Let's go now to Margaret and Kate. Guys, Mitt Romney, 2012, jumped into the presidential campaign this week. But the White House is all too eager right now to be drawing attention to his signature Massachusetts health care law. Let's take a listen to what the president has had to say on it.
I agree with Mitt Romney, who recently said he's proud of what he accomplished on health care in Massachusetts and supports giving states the power to determine their own health care solutions. He's right.
So Mitt Romney's exploring a presidential run. Maybe the White House is afraid of him, and that's why the president is coming out like this. But is this going to be a problem for him, Margaret?
How annoying it must be to be reminded that he was once a moderate Republican businessman who recognized that the essence of health care reform is a mandate in which everybody goes into the insurance pool so that rates for everybody go down.
Which they haven't been doing.
So Kate, is he going to have to disavow his health care law?
Well, you know, it strikes me watching his video this week. He strikes me as a very attractive candidate in a general election. you know, a proven executive in both the private sector and in public. He's created jobs. He's reassuring with the kind of economy we have, but he's got to get to a general election and navigate a primary process controlled by people who are really animated against the plan he imposed in Massachusetts.
Well, let's continue talking about health care, Medicare. The president this week came out with his own budget proposal, but he hit Republican Paul Ryan pretty hard on his Medicare proposal, which the White House is saying would be a voucher-like program. The president said it paints a pessimistic view of the country's future and basically tells seniors that they're on their own. It's an argument the White House wants to have. Kate, is it going to work?
Look, Medicare's going bankrupt in the next 9 years. It's growing at twice the rate of the economy. Paul Ryan and the Republicans are determined to save Medicare, they'll say. They explain, in order to avoid the kind of wrenching changes that a bankrupt system would impose. So they're proposing these fundamental reforms for people 55 years and below. People have to understand the problem that the program faces to be open to that kind of fundamental change, and the president, by denying the problem, is not going to help them.
And Margaret, last word, will it work?
They're not saving Medicare. They're saving the insurance industry by a voucher program. Medicare was instituted to save seniors from an insurance industry that was scamming them. And by the way, this is a cohort full of pre-existing conditions. By the time you're 65, that's what you have. They cannot go out into the insurance world on their own, and that's what Paul Ryan would have them seniors do.
Well, I think we're going to be continuing to hear a lot about Paul Ryan's Medicare proposal and what the White House thinks about it. But thank you guys for joining us this week. We'll see you again next week when Al will be back. Thanks so much.
Political Capital is a production of Bloomberg Television.